Since I'm the first one up here, I will probably run some slides by that have concepts that will be covered by other people. Many of those concepts, I'm just going to go right by them so that I can get to the meat of this. History is one of the things that I really appreciate. And there's a lot of myths and misconceptions out there, and I hope to be able to clear them up for you. American government is responsible for much of the misinformation. Unfortunately, because of the economics and the money power of the U.S., these lies and misperceptions get spread throughout the world. And in fact, as I told the people in New Zealand a couple of years ago, their government has lied to them, the same as the American government has lied to the American people. I know you folks in Australia are sharper than the folks in New Zealand. No, I'm just kidding. But your government has lied to you as well. All of you that are here are pioneers, and you are going to suffer some of the slings and arrows of people who prefer hysteria and myths to the facts. Those of you who are physicians who are going to get into the cannabinoid medicine arena are going to find it the most satisfying part of your medical career. It will allow you to have excellent doctor-patient relationship because the patient recognizes that when they tell you that cannabis is a medicine that helps them and you say, yes, tell me more, rather than roll your eyes or say, never darken my door again, they're going to recognize you as a true healer. And I think you're going to get an enormous amount of satisfactions. People who are patients are going to have many of their symptoms alleviated or at least gotten better, and it may even help their health. Okay, so we've got some challenges to overcome this 110 years of propaganda. We need to address doctor and patient fears. We need to educate everybody about the endocannabinoid system. I'm not going to go into the tips for legislators, but you're going to be working on that. Physician tips, you need to learn about the endocannabinoid system, learn about cannabinoids and terpenes. You need to treat cannabis as you would any other medicine, and just basically practice good medicine. So let's jump into the history here. Cannabis has been in every major materia medica ever written, starting with the Ping Tao Ching in 2637 BC, allegedly written by Shan Nen, possibly the second emperor of China, possibly a mythical figure, and I could go on, but I won't. And it's been in Ayurvedic medicine, materia medica, the Ebers Papyrus, Discordus, and cannabis was in the United States pharmacopoeia from the 1850s until 1942. Cannabis is an entheogen, a spiritual aid, and this actually is in some cases to its detriment because you have some of the more conservative elements of mainstream religions that are put off by that. Okay, so cannabis was sort of banned from Europe, as it were, by the Pope in the 15th century, said that it was a tool of the devil, and he did this because midwives used it to decrease the pain of childbearing. He called midwives witches. So cannabis finally came back to Europe from Napoleon's army coming back from Egypt, and W.B. O'Shaughnessy from India, where he did some experiments and also was important in putting the telegraph across India. And Sir Joshua Reynolds was the Queen's physician. He wrote a Lancet article, and from watching Dr. Caldicott's presentation yesterday, I've got the date wrong. It's the 1890, I guess. And there we have the Queen, and she was prescribed tincture of cannabis by Dr. Reynolds. So cannabis can't help everyone, but it can help you if you have any number of conditions: arthritis, asthma, depression, glaucoma, pain, and the list goes on and on. And this is why it was in the United States Pharmacopoeia from 1854 to 1941. Sir William Osler is considered to be the founder of modern medicine. He was one of the co-founders of Johns Hopkins University. He wrote the first textbook of internal medicine in 1892, and in that he said that cannabis was the best treatment for migraine headaches. We started to have a move towards prohibition as early as the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 in the United States, which is the most effective drug law ever passed. It prohibited nothing. It required that the ingredients of patent medicine be placed on the bottle. The sale of patent medicines dropped by about 50% within 2 years of the passage of that. Harrison Narcotic Tax Act of 1914 was really directed at Chinese. There was a hostility towards Chinese in the United States, in part because they worked hard and they worked cheap. And this is great when the economy was going good, but when it wasn't, that was considered unfair competition. There were a couple of drug warriors named Bishop Brent and I forgot the doctor's name now, but he was a nephew-in-law to the President of the United States. And they had been on a mission to make these drugs illegal, to make the opiates illegal or difficult to get, particularly smoking opium. But in order to get the appropriate votes in the United States legislature, they added cocaine so they could get the Southern votes because of the racist anti-black attitudes. Cannabis, as most of you know, has been a medicine for over 4,000 years. It was the third most common ingredient in patent medicines at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And in the 1920s, American physicians wrote 3 million prescriptions a year that contained cannabis, and there were over 25 patent medicines on the market that contained cannabis. My father was a pharmacist. He told me about cannabis as a medicine in about 1959 or 1960. He was talking about alcohol prohibition, and he said that one of their assignments when he was a freshman at the University of Minnesota School of Pharmacy in 1928 was to make tincture cannabis. And he said, of course, we had to be very careful because the alcohol was illegal. Louis Armstrong, who those of you who are my age know was a great jazz great, and in his autobiography he wrote that had he not smoked Muggles or Mary Jane, which the African Americans referred to cannabis as, he would not have been able to deal with the rampant racism that existed in the United States then and unfortunately still exists today, as you may have noticed from our president. Phytochemicals went out of style. You had the Flexner Report, which was paid for by the Carnegie Foundation, and it tended to favor allopathic physicians, so I benefited from that indirectly, I guess. And it marginalized a lot of the medical specialties that favored herbal medicine or plant-based medicine, osteopaths, naturopaths, homeopaths. And also, we went through a time in the late 1880s and early 1900s with numerous inventions, and plant-based medicine was seen as old-fashioned. Fortunately, that's going out of style now, and we're getting more enthusiasm about plant-based medicine, not just cannabis, but other plant-based medicine. So we then sort of start to pivot into the reefer madness era. And the reefer madness era was generated by two things. One is the economics. And as you'll see, I pinned the tail on the donkey on the oil companies, but it also related to racism and to the desire to have the largest law enforcement bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. I sometimes think that Harry Anslinger gets way more credit than he deserves for the Marijuana Tax Act. That credit really belongs to Lamont DuPont, who is really a point man for the petrochemical industry. So you ended up having an enormous amount of propaganda, which was not based on anything medical. Eventually, as you'll see, the AMA testified against the Marijuana Tax Act. But in the meantime, you had all this fear of jazz and sex and violence. And much of the charges were inconsistent with each other. The reefer madness, I remember seeing it in the 1970s in Berkeley, and people just broke up laughing. It was so absurd and ridiculous. There was a lot of racism. If you look at this, you'll see that the man with the syringe, I've not heard much of people injecting cannabis. I think that's to be avoided, right? And not very easy to do because it's not water soluble, and the woman is not African American. So you had people were not hampered by the facts. And the use of the demonology, I think, is noteworthy. I wrote a book, a couple of books that have the idea of the demonization of this drug. So Anslinger was a raving racist. In fact, I gave a poster presentation at the International Cannabinoid Research Society, and they let us keep it up for the whole thing. And the next day after I put it up, the president of the organization said, you know, those quotes are racist. I said, yes, I know. She said, a lot of people found them offensive. I said, yes, so do I. That's why I put them up there, is so that the researchers would understand why they have to sort of tiptoe around this when they're doing research, and why they have to use synthetics like Win 550 or even synthetic THC rather than using the cannabis plant. So Anslinger was involved in sort of a power race, I guess, with J. Edgar Hoover to see who would be the most powerful bureaucrat dealing with the law enforcement. But he was quite a racist. Now, the reason that I say that Anslinger was likely not the prime mover is because cannabis is such an economically important plant. This article was in Popular Mechanics in 1938. Those of you that are familiar with that publication know that it's not considered to be a real radical publication. DuPont was concerned about competition for all kinds of things. They were the largest shareholder in General Motors, so when Ford had a prototype car that ran on hemp ethanol and was made almost entirely out of hemp, they felt they had to do something. And I think that's what caused them to be supporters of the Marijuana Tax Act. The Marijuana Tax Act was opposed by the American Medical Association. Dr. Woodward wasn't just anybody. He was the former Commissioner of Health for Washington, D.C., past president of the American Public Health Association, and goes on and on. In his testimony before the House Ways and Means Committee, he said that cannabis, that the AMA knew of no dangers from the medical use of cannabis. The tax made it more cumbersome to use cannabis, and in 1941, it was kicked out of the United States Pharmacopoeia. Anslinger was thinking of targeting all kinds of singers and comedians who used cannabis. In 1947, the Secretary of the Treasury closed that down. Robert Mitchum was arrested. Some of you who are as old as I am might remember him. He thought that it was going to ruin his career. There he is in court with one of the other people that was arrested in that bust, Lila Leeds. She got one last acting job in a movie that was written by the same guy that wrote Reefer Madness. Her career ended. Mitchum, not so much. Mitchum's career continued. In 1948, Anslinger changed his tune. When he testified in 1937, he said cannabis made you a murderer, sort of, you would kill your brother in an instant. In 1948, he said it made you a passive commie dupe. He wanted to have it both ways. Of course, he was lying through his teeth the whole time. As you know, we began to change. We started to have the LaGuardia report, where the New York Academy of Medicine recommended legalizing cannabis for recreational use. In 1947, you had a study showing that synthetic THC was helpful in stopping epileptic seizures in kids with cerebral palsy. 5 of 7 had almost no seizures, and they had been institutionalized for intractable seizures. And we continue to have important things in terms of research that was done, and you're going to hear more about that later. And this is just a lengthy accounting of some of the things that many of you are familiar with. Because of the limitations of time, I'm not going to go into each one of these. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 came about in part because the United States Supreme Court found that the Marijuana Tax Act was unconstitutional. And the Marijuana Tax Act had really prevented research from going on. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 required some scheduling of various drugs. And they recommended legalizing cannabis. This was after President Nixon, who appointed 9 of the 13 members, admonished them not to recommend legalizing cannabis, which they did after doing a fairly extensive study. And this is a pretty good research piece. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about modern medicinal cannabis and get into the mythology. This is the research I told you about with the cerebral palsy. And of course, we owe our presence here to Dr. Meshulam, who in 1964 isolated and characterized the THC molecule. In 1978, the United States government, on the one hand, still saying that cannabis had no medical value, started giving cannabis to a small group of people who had serious diseases. Eventually, there were as many as 15 people. Many of them have died off. There are still 4 people receiving 7 to 9 pounds of cannabis from the federal government, even though it's illegal federally in the United States. We know that cannabis is a complicated plant, and we know that there's a lot of inconsistencies, that while cannabis is a Schedule I drug in the United States, THC, the stuff that causes euphoria, is a Schedule III drug. And the endocannabinoid system was discovered sometime between the late 1980s and 1990s, or characterized, and you're going to hear much, much more about that, so let me move on. And it's made up of a couple of receptors, a couple of neurotransmitters, and a couple of enzymes. And the CB1 receptors are largely in the brain, the CB2 receptors are largely in the immune system. One of the things that's important is something called retrograde inhibition. The endocannabinoid system is central to homeostasis. It's also important in mediating the speed of neurotransmission. This is just a model discussing retrograde inhibition, which is the way it modulates the speed of neurotransmission, and you'll hear more of that later on. So it's a plant. And you have to ask yourself why people who take a moral exception to cannabis, who presumably are familiar with the Bible, don't recognize it as a plant that was put on the planet by a being more powerful than us. And terpenes are important. Dr. Russo, who you hear from, really has drilled down in that information a lot. This is a good report you might want to take a look at, 1997 House of Lords. Sativex we're all familiar with. What they've done is done an alcohol extract, put together THC and CBD, and charge you 5 to 6 times as much as you need to pay if you were producing it yourself. Maybe 10 times as much, depending on how prolific a grower you are. The entourage effect is an important concept to be familiar with. That's basically the combined therapeutic attributes of all of the therapeutic constituents of the plant, of which there are many, cannabinoids, terpenes, and I would guess probably some of the flavonoids as well. So let's get into debunking the myths here. Cannabis is not a medicine. I think that 4,000 years of history tells us that cannabis is a medicine. I know tens of thousands, if not millions of patients that have benefited from this tell us that cannabis isn't a medicine. I think what they mean when they say cannabis isn't a medicine is it's harder for the pharmaceutical companies to make money off of this than it is for things that they'd like you to think are medicine. And cannabis has a lot of therapeutic value. You're going to hear a lot about them. Pain, anxiety are certainly two of the most important, but the list is as long as your arm. After all, cannabis is central to homeostasis. And here's some more things that it's useful for. ADD is something that I've done a lot of work with, same with PTSD, also with autism, which I'll be talking about later. Cannabis is not safe. The Wooten Commission in the UK, the India Hemp Commission in 1894, the Nixon Commission, the South Australian Commission in, I think, 1978, the Ledane Commission in Canada, all of them said that cannabis was safe and that it should be legalized. These were people who actually knew what they were talking about as opposed to the politicians who want to get reelected. And we already saw that the American Medical Association testified against the Marijuana Tax Act, and the DEA's chief administrative law judge said that they knew that it was one of the safest therapeutic agents known to man. Oh, this shows you the dependency risk of various recreational drugs, and cannabis has less of a dependency risk than coffee. So I suggest, now, I don't know about tea, because tea has more caffeine in it than coffee, so maybe you just want to have some water when you break here, if you're worried about getting strung out on something. And the common side effects are often none, euphoria, and as I like to quote Dr. Abrams, he's speaking, I hate to steal his thunder, but he's an oncologist, and he says, in his patient population, a little euphoria isn't a bad thing. Okay, and the side effects of cannabis are dose-related. So if you take a small dose, you're likely to have no side effects or small side effects. If you take a large dose, you're likely to have large side effects. Now, one of the things that I think is important for us here is to separate the medicinal use of cannabis from the recreational use of cannabis. With the medicinal use of cannabis, the goal is to relieve the symptoms of the condition that you're trying to treat, or to achieve improved health with the maximum effect and the smallest amount of side effects. Whereas with the recreational use of cannabis, the goal is to get higher than a kite. And you're likely to have a lot more side effects with the recreational use, where you're not particularly concerned about the dose, you're not particularly concerned about the ratio of THC to CBD. And here's some more side effects. Now, there's a lot of things that you can do to treat these. You can use CBD, which tends to decrease the euphoria by about a third. There's a product on the market that came out called Ondu. There are certain terpenes like limonene and pinene that may be helpful. Cannabis in the raw form has an acid group, and it is non-euphoric. The suppository route, you're not as likely to get high because it takes longer to get into the bloodstream and to go through the liver. So you can treat the high with, as I said, CBD, pinene, limonene, peppercorn. A common sort of street wisdom is if you get uncomfortably high, bite down on a peppercorn, and the beta-caryophyllene that's in there will help block the CB1 receptor. And hydration is also helpful, and the common advice for anybody is to start low and go slow. Okay, so juicing is something that Dr. William Courtney is the expert on, and if you're juicing the raw plant, you're taking cannabis in the acid form. Myth number 3, THC in your bloodstream always impairs your driving. The fact of the matter is that the standard warning in the FDA gives for psychoactive drugs applies to THC. Warning, don't drive, operate heavy equipment, or engage in dangerous activity until you determine whether or not this interferes with those activities. So, what the government of the United States is saying, We don't care how much THC there is in your bloodstream. And in fact, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says exactly that. It says that there's no relationship between the THC level in your blood and your being driving impaired. Furthermore, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says that there's no increased accident risk with the use of cannabis. Recognize that with a passenger in your car, you double the risk of accident. Also, they say if you are impaired, you tend to drive more carefully and more slowly. So that's another reason why it doesn't increase the accident risk. Now, I am not telling you to get higher than a kite and go out and drive. What I am telling you is that when they take a blood THC level and try to say that you were impaired, that doesn't prove anything except that you use cannabis. If you're a regular cannabis user, you may have used it as long ago as 6 weeks, and you'll still have some THC in your bloodstream because it's fat soluble and deposited in the adipose tissue. I think we get confused by saying, well, alcohol does this. Well, alcohol is unique. It doesn't affect any particular receptor. It's a non-specific neurodepressant. Cannabis is an exit drug. It's not a gateway drug. I have alcoholics, I have opiate abusers, I have cocaine users, all of whom attribute their no longer using the drug that they were abusing to cannabis. And we know that there are a number of studies starting up in the United States, and I'm sure around the world, using cannabis as part of a multimodality approach to dealing with the so-called opiate crisis. Just an editorial note, the opiate crisis is that people with legitimate pain are no longer getting adequately treated. Yeah, cannabis is not addictive. This was concluded by any number of well-informed people, including the Nixon marijuana folks. There's a psychiatrist, Langley Porter, in San Francisco named Rhys Jones, and in the 1970s, he had an experiment that he was sure would demonstrate that cannabis was addictive. He gave people 200 milligrams of THC a day. Now, that's a lot. I mean, if you're treating anxiety, you use 2.5 to 5 milligrams 3 times a day. You're talking about 7.5 to 15 milligrams. So Rhys Jones gives them 200 milligrams, and then he abruptly stops their dosage and is looking for withdrawal symptoms. What does he find? Well, I think he finds that most of the people who were all heavy users before they volunteered for the program had been self-treating themselves for anxiety and sleep and depression. And lo and behold, those are the symptoms they had when they abruptly stopped, which they had for about 3 or 4 days. Not really significant withdrawal symptoms, no addiction to cannabis. This idea that cannabis is bad for the lungs, now, Dr. Caldecott was talking about Caladonna, which is an Australian cigarette in the 1920s used for treating asthma and COPD. And I'm going to give you an ad that I have from an archivist in the States. And cannabis is a bronchodilator. Cannabis is a anti-inflammatory, and it is useful in treating asthma. Now, some asthma patients find that it's irritating to the bronchi, and they don't prefer the smoking route, the respiratory route of administration. Others do. Certainly taken orally, the anti-inflammatory and bronchodilatory effects of the cannabinoids will be very helpful. Dr. Tashkin, Dr. Tashkin did a study in the early part of this century of 2,200 people and basically found that the more cannabis that you smoked, the less likely you were to get lung cancer. Again, I do not suggest that you go out and smoke a lot of cannabis, but I would suggest that studies be done to show the anti-cancer effects of cannabis. And again, Don, I hope I'm not, Dr. Abrams, stepping on your best lines, but he says that there's more than enough basic science and anecdotal reports to justify doing double-blind studies for cannabis to treat cancer. And there was such a double-blind study done in the UK, which showed that it could extend life of people with glioblastoma by 180 days. Cannabis does cause, when you smoke it, increased bronchial irritation, increased cough, and increased sputum production. Okay, and I mentioned about the asthma cigarettes, and there's the Canadana, Grimaldi. Dr. Caldecott showed a picture of the cigars de joy. Those were all on the market in the 1920s for treating asthma. Cannabis does not cause brain damage. Cannabis is neuroprotective. Dr. Meshulam invented something called dexabanol, which in research with mice showed that if you have ischemia in the brain, that there's less neural damage when they have cannabinoids on board than if they don't. The monkey study. This was done in the 1970s by a overzealous researcher who wanted to prove that cannabis caused brain damage. What he proved is that lack of oxygen causes brain damage. He exposed the monkeys to cannabis smoke, nothing, and then when he sacrificed them, couldn't find any brain damage. So he put a gas mask on them and filled the gas mask with lots of cannabis smoke and not very much oxygen. And lo and behold, when he sacrificed those monkeys, they had brain damage, something that we had known long before that study. Effect on IQ. The studies that have been done on IQ do not correct for all these other variables. The studies that have been done that correct for that show nothing, which is what I think is actually the case. So just because somebody said, we have this eight-point drop, why do we have that 8-point drop? They smoke cannabis. Did you correct for anything else? No, we didn't correct for anything else. Well, then your research, let's see if we can reproduce that research, and we can't. There just isn't any well-controlled study that's been done that demonstrates brain damage. And also, I know this is very controversial, but smoking cannabis during pregnancy also does not cause fetal effects. There was an excellent presentation made at Patients Out of Time in 2014 by Sierra Vargas Torres, who's a professor at Columbia. And I think for her thesis, she reviewed 30 different studies on the use of cannabis during pregnancy. These were funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, so the reports were all slanted to try to emphasize the negative outcomes, of which there were few. There were only 8 negative outcomes out of 360 variables, and the 8 negative findings were not consistent from one study to the other study. It basically proved that cannabis was harmless. Also, there was a study done by Melanie Dreyer in Jamaica in the late 60s and early 70s, where she demonstrated that children whose mothers used cannabis during pregnancy reached their developmental landmarks sooner and had a higher IQ than the women of children who did not use cannabis. When she adjusted that for the educational background of the mothers, both groups had relatively low educational backgrounds. She found there was no difference. And these are some of the variables that you need to take into consideration when you're talking about such complicated things as brain damage. And when you're trying to isolate out only cannabis, you need to make accommodations for all of these other variables that may impact IQ and may impact fetal development. And it's almost impossible to make those kinds of adjustments. The Controlled Substances Act makes no sense when it starts scheduling things. Schedule 1, cannabis. Schedule 3, THC, the euphorogen in cannabis. Just makes no sense whatsoever. And Schedule 5, Epidiolex, which is CBD. So there's several universities in the United States that are studying cannabis. In California, University of California, San Diego, School of Medicine, UCI, UC Davis, UCLA, and I know that there are a number of places here in Australia that are studying this as well. What the oldest one, the California Medical Cannabis Research Center says is that they can't find any scientific reason why cannabis is in Schedule 1. But I hope that you realize that you've been lied to. I've been lied to. That cannabis is a medicine, and that if we set aside our hysteria and take a look at the science, we're going to be much better off. Now, clearly, we need to do more studies. We need to question whether or not we should pharmaceuticalize cannabis. After all, I think Australia is a lot like the U.S., rugged individualism, personal responsibility. Why should you put your health in the hands of big pharma when you can grow healthy food in your backyard? And Hippocrates said medicine is food and food is medicine. And cannabis is really too good for its own good. It has an enormous amount of therapeutic value, therapeutic benefit. It has a great historical pedigree, and that doesn't mean that there still isn't things that we need to do. I think one of the problems that we have in the U.S. and you have here is over-regulation, over-taxation. The politicians don't really look at the benefit. They seem to be looking at how much revenue they can generate. And one of my complaints I have in the U.S. is that we don't dispense cannabis from pharmacies, from drugstores. They're dispensaries. And most states don't require that the dispensary be run by a pharmacist or even run by a nurse. So, we need to deal with cannabis as the medicine that it is. And we need to take it seriously. And, we need to have standards for products. And we need to know how much THC, how much CBD, how much some of the other cannabinoids, how much some of the terpenes are in there. I mean, one of the things that I tell my patients is just because cannabis has been illegal for 75 years doesn't mean it's a miracle drug. Doesn't mean that it'll cure everything. But I have been pleased with the number of patients who have benefited, and I know that you'll hear from the other speakers about some of the wonderful benefits that patients have gotten and some of the research that undergirds this. And the fact is that you need to recognize that almost always the negative things you hear about cannabis, the opposite is true. It's not a gateway drug. It's an exit drug. It doesn't cause brain damage. It's neuroprotective. It doesn't cause you to go crazy. Dr. Daniel Piamelli at UC Irvine has shown it's been useful in treating bipolar disorder. There are certainly some cautions and precautions that you need to take, but I think that you can be very comfortable looking at the fact that there's a 4,000-year history of the medical use of cannabis, and the fact that back when Harry Anslinger was trying to spread all this reefer madness, the American Medical Association was saying, all Mr. Anslinger has is a fistful of newspaper clippings. Of course, what the AMA didn't know is he wrote most of those newspaper articles. He was the ghostwriter. I don't know how many of you remember Rodney Dangerfield, but he was a patient of mine. I can tell you that because he wrote a book called It Ain't Easy Being Me, and in it there's a picture of him looking at a piece of paper saying, here I am looking at the best piece of mail I ever got, a letter from Dr. Bearman telling me to smoke more pot. Now, that's not actually what the letter said. Oh, I wanted to get to the Shameless Commerce Division here. This is a book that I've written, and another book that I've written, and that's available here. If you want to get in touch with me, here's how you can get in touch with me. And I'm also, here's some references. There are an enormous number of books that are available out there, and you have an enormous resource here in Dr. Caldecott, Lucy Haslam, and a vast number of researchers and clinicians here in Australia. You're going to enjoy this conference. It was my pleasure to be the kickoff speaker. Thank you very much.